Testing.
Testing.
All right. We are recording.
Welcome.
Welcome to the Anatomy of a Strategy podcast. I'm Carlos Pacheco.
And I'm Tara Hunt.
And we're recording from a very rainy Toronto.
Yes, absolutely drizzly and miserable outside. So that leads us to be kind of drizzly and miserable ourselves today.
You would say we're drizzly and miserable about traditional media?
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about legacy ideas of media and marketing that I say ruin everything, but really they're basically ruining the digital media that they come to take up after they see it's popularized.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of the reason why we're seeing stuff like, Proposition 13 in the UK. You're seeing all this stuff happening in UK where big media companies are trying to just stop the way the internet works, right? And that's that thinking that just brings everything down. So
quick little backgrounder on this. And part of the reason why we're talking about this is both Carlos and I, well, especially myself, but Carlos as well for many years, have been working in basically in online spaces in digital media. I do come from a bit of a traditional marketing background where I went into a traditional ad agency early on in my career. But I was already very indoctrinated to the web and the way of thinking in the web when I went into that agency. So a lot of things seemed backwards to me. And so I've always kind of been webby, always kind of been that way. And so early days of me being online, blogging, working in online communities and forums, and then, moving into other content and community and social media spaces. I was really, and I still am, a big advocate for this idea of this groundswell, this customer-focused, customer-based, customer-driven economy. And so I always saw that as something that the media world, the ad agency world should just shut up and start listening. But the problem is here I was like, rah, 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 look at the internet here. And what happened is they did come, right? We saw advertising agencies, we saw marketers, big companies and media companies see the power of the internet. They saw all these people going and doing all these powerful, amazing things. They saw influencers rise, such and so forth. And they said, oh, we want some of that. And then came into this space and they ruined everything. And they continue to ruin things. Yeah. So every time there's a trend like, oh, video is the big thing now, or podcasting is the big thing now. Every time we see these traditional media companies or these traditional agencies come into these spaces, they come in with a lens to their legacy thinking. And their legacy thinking comes in and they basically, it's like they poop in the pool. I think I talked about this with Erica M as well. They take a dump in the pool and they go, well, this doesn't work. And then they leave a disaster, scorched earth. And it's pissing me off to no end. I am sorry to say, but actually I'm not sorry to say. Sorry, not sorry. It is ridiculous the amount of breaking they do. They see something that's working. They come in and they apply their old-fashioned thinking, and then they screw it up for everybody else. They move along and say, well, that didn't work, and kind of leave in their wake a wreck. And I would blame a lot of the ills of social media today on those bad eggs. They have, because they put an emphasis on things like influence and big numbers. And so people try to follow suit just to make a buck in the world.
It's also probably one of the reasons why platforms ebb and flow, right? And they get super hot, everybody's into them. And then the brands come in, completely mess up the ecosystem because their goals are different from the audience's goals. Look at the growth.
Well, and the brands And just to sort of, sorry to jump in and stomp all over this, obviously I'm very passionate about this. The platforms are such weaselly little idiots that they go, oh, brands, yes, please, we want your validation and money, so we're going to change everything to suit you. And that's really what, I mean, so it's not just the marketing and media and brands and traditional thinking, it's also these platforms, they tend to get short-sighted.
Well, short-sighted because the advertising money is the easy money, right? It's, actually building a product that people want to pay for on the internet? No, no, we can't do that. We can't spend effort to do that. It's not going to scale. But, we know for a fact that, there are tons of companies now that are growing with a paid model, and it's the web's matured, and people are starting to understand or seeing the value of a paid platform. Again, my point was sort of being like the proliferation of platforms like Discord, right, and Slack.
Yeah,
right?
But they're gonna be ruined too.
Well, it's not. Slack is paid, right? So they don't need to be advertising, right? And at Discord, there's a high chance it will be because it's a free platform addressing gamers. Gamers tend to not want to pay for any sort of like software support or for community stuff.
So it's our fault too. You're all to blame.
Yeah, we're all to blame.
Yeah. Well, so, as you're talking and as we're talking about this, before we go into what we mean by they've ruined everything and some more specific examples and drilling into that, the one example of where this hasn't really happened and that company has taken over the world, and that is Google. So what I mean by that is I remember in early days of search engine land, right? So we have all these search engines, trying to be the dominant search engine for the world. And so you had Ask Jeeves and Alta Vista and what was Yahoo? The one, the Dogpile and Yahoo, all these different search engines. And there was this little Google search engine that came in. And what a lot of the search engines were doing is they were bending to the demands and the desires of the advertisers. Mm-hmm. They were creating a search engine for the people to search on and find what they wanted to find. But in order to make money, they basically appeased the advertisers by making their search engines completely crap by putting like all the advertisers up higher and made it so that the usability of those search engines was no longer the forefront of their model. Yep. Whereas Google was, I think their innovation, other than their algorithm is great, of course, but their real innovation was, no, advertisers are going to take a back seat. If we grow and we are the best search engine, they took this long game approach. They said, if the public, the people can find what they're looking for, and of course, they're not perfect. I'm not saying Google's perfect. But if they can find what they're looking for, then the advertisers will benefit too. Yeah. So they made actual coding and, user interface decisions, like base decisions that improved the lot of the searcher. Yeah. Nobody learned from that, right? So you saw all these other search engines die. And if they still are around, I'm sorry, but nobody uses them. And then over on the other side of so they changed that thought where the advertisers could rule the day. But now you see like all these social media platforms, these social networks, then even including Snapchat, right? Mm-hmm. They all changed fundamental things about their platforms that the community loved and thrived on because the advertisers or the marketers or the media companies wanted to somehow like
get in touch,
hijack.
Yeah, those. Of course. Yeah, that's the number one goal we have. Yeah. Again, like I'm gonna put my being in media industry hat from about getting close to 10 years ago is we would regularly call Google and say, hey Google, can we have the front page? Please give us the front page. Or hey Google, it hurt us. Our smart speaker doesn't want to listen, wants to listen in. We would call our rep and say, hey, can you get the front page? They'd vehemently say no. But like that's the pressure they're consistently on, right? The brands constantly bug every platform. Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we do this? And the platforms usually haven't thought about it yet. And then they'll get their coders to do it to sell, to make money, right? That's essentially it. Google was great, and it's still great, but it's definitely sort of like the advertisers have won in a certain point. Because if you look at certain search results nowadays, you'll see more ads than actual organic results, depending on the category you're searching for. And that's, to me, a very dangerous place they're playing with.
Yeah.
But, it's still the number one. It's still everybody wants to use it. But we're also starting to see DuckDuckGo, which, many years ago, everybody was sort of like, yeah, okay, cool. But now every year they've been growing, and everybody's starting to look at that one as a different model. But
all right, we totally digress on that one. Really, this is just only really to introduce how and why we're speaking a different language altogether, and talk about these legacy ideas of media marketing that have invaded a lot of these spaces, and why this is so wrong. So shall we start with that then?
Of course.
Excellent. So number one, the first legacy idea of media marketing that ruined everything was quality equals high production. So Carlos, what does this mean?
It means that you need to spend a crap load of money to get anybody to pay attention to you, which is a complete, false idea. What you need to do when you spend a crap load of money on content is you need to spend a crap load of money to advertise it.
So high quality production, and I'm putting air quotes madly in the air, is all about multiple cameras and like fancy cameras and big teams of people and sound teams and lighting teams and everything that you would be putting into a studio level production of things. So that means on video, that is the way, or you have like a fancy sound studio and a podcast. We're sitting here in our living room condo. Most creators we know have done the same. So I think when it comes to quality means a very different thing on the internet. It also means a very different thing for the audience. And individual creators, people who have built enormous audiences over the years online, did so usually, sitting in their living room, kitchen, bedroom, some room in their house, no fancy studio, with a very cheap camera or just a cell phone, bad sound, bad lighting to begin with, and they built an audience. And they've demonstrated time and time again that it isn't the quality, I'm putting the air quotes up again, of production that matters. Quality means something very different. So quality on the web and to the audience, it means what? Relevance of the content. So what does it mean to me? How does it connect with me? Usefulness of the content, value to me as the audience member, interestingness. So there's a lot of things that are out there that we've come across, of course, that are like, boy, I didn't know this was content that I would enjoy, but now I'm enjoying it.
You think of the phenomenon of ASMR, right?
Right.
I don't personally enjoy it, but I can understand why there's people who enjoy that.
Mukbang.
Exactly,
right? People watching people eat food for hours, right? So that's like, and it's interesting. There's a whole bunch of things that make these things interesting. They're not high level quality productions, but also like science stuff, right? I think the growth in knowledge around science and like those quote unquote boring subjects that, we love this stuff because what's happened is you have people like ASAP Science, who are actually from Toronto, who make the whiteboard videos around scientific concepts. Like they have made this kind of content interesting and accessible. And so accessibility is another piece of this. And by the way, they record their sound in a closet, or they used to. They might have gone up from there now that they are doing well. But they started in a closet because closets don't have the echo. And they use an actual whiteboard with a camera pointed down on it and emotionally engaging, right? So you want to be able to connect with your audience. So that's what quality means, right? That's what quality means for the audience. And it's demonstrated time and time again. There's literally a million examples of that. Quality is not about high levels of production, but it's the problem with focus on high levels of production isn't just because it's blind to what's really happening in the world, but it also takes focus away from what the audience, and it takes focus away from what the audience wants. And so brands keep like throwing all this money, you know, their agencies are telling them to do this and that, and they need super high quality this and that. And what happens is they do this thing where they're like, well, that didn't really work very well. Well, I guess content doesn't work then.
Yeah.
And they go away from it, and they leave in their wake, well, what I call like kind of like internet junk.
Yeah.
It's like space junk that's just floating around. There's a lot of internet junk that's just floating around when it comes to the content that's out there. And because they just push it out there and they walk away from it, for me, it's a waste of money, which they could be putting into what really matters, those sustainable elements, which brings me to number 2, the sustainability. So online, we think in terms, when we think about content, when we think about community, when we think about marketing and any media and all those realms, when you're a digital thinker, you think about consistency. Like, how can we do this in a sustainable, consistent way for a long period of time and be iterative about it, versus seasonal and campaign thinking.
Every single brand only thinks about the product that they're launching right now, and then they'll run a campaign for a month, 2 months, 3 months.
Yeah.
You know, I've seen annual campaigns with different tactics and stuff, and then the next year, okay, well, same product, but we need to say something completely different. And the only learnings we have is the learnings from
media buys,
right? Not really from, it's an ad, right? So you can't really measure it as content.
Well, then there's not enough of it because you don't have the budget to do a full year of ongoing content pieces that you get feedback on and iterate on, right? So what happens is when you don't have that feedback enabled into that production process is you go into a room, usually it's a room or some sort of like writer's room or whatever, you ideate, these are great ideas. Sometimes they will ideate based on research, not really great in-depth research.
Not deep research.
And then what they do is they produce all of, you know, they plan really heavily and they produce, like, there's very little room for any sort of riffing or iterating on an idea. Just recently, I was invited to be part of a process where I was sitting with the person that I was supposed to be recording with, and we were having these great conversations, and we were told basically, stop having those conversations because we need to reel you in and get this locked down for 6 episodes. And I said, well, shouldn't we just go in maybe and riff together for a bunch of time and see where it goes and sort of build on that? Nope. No. That's not how it works in media land. So, you know, so there's this idea of like locking everything down, producing it, and then pushing out those finished episodes or those finished products and putting a whole bunch of media buy behind it. And then moving on.
Yep.
And I think the problem with this whole seasonal campaign thinking versus thinking about it in an iterative, consistent, sustainable way comes from the way that quarterly reporting is set up. This immediacy, right? That's this thinking, this short-termism that has been proliferated and actually made even worse, I think, in more recent years with this immediacy of reporting from the digital spaces themselves. In those immediate digital reporting metrics like impressions and reach, which we'll talk about next, I don't think they come from the digital world. Like early content creators, people that were doing things online, building communities, they wouldn't compare numbers. They kind of went with their gut on whether something was working or not. And I know that's a little bit too vague in general because we should always measure something.
Yeah.
Because we do want to see whether we progress or not and see how we can improve. But the problem is these legacy numbers came into play. And those legacy numbers lead me to number 3. And what's number 3?
Impressions?
Well, thinking about breadth, bigness, like those kind of metrics versus depth.
Yeah.
Like, how deep are our relationships? How deep is our loyalty? So there's been a focus on old school, broad metrics like impressions and reach for a long time.
Yeah, and then nowadays we're focusing a little bit more on engagement, right?
Right. But the problem is because we're focusing on engagement, which could be a good metric. I think that if we really understand and think about true engagement, that would be amazing. But we've all now seen those pictures of thousands of phones being plugged into a machine in some little room in usually somewhere in Asia where they have these click farms going.
Yeah, that's true.
And those click farms, they're not creating impressions. They're fudging engagement.
Yeah.
They're liking posts. You've seen these comments. Great content.
This was awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Like all of those sort of those fake engagements, views on videos. Like I did a video not too long ago. We've talked about this on this show, is that there is so much fraud when it comes to engagement metrics. And I feel like everywhere we're going to like shift our focus, like, oh no, it should be this now. The fraud will find a way there.
Well, I think you're right. You're absolutely right. One of the smartest moves that Google, YouTube made a couple of years ago is to try to bring everybody into watch time, right? And because it's really hard to fake watch time. It's really hard to mass produce it, right? It's probably not cost efficient for a click farm to do watch time, right? That's where, we see value in good content, in using that metric to grow, to make good content. And less about the clicks, less about the surface level engagement. It's watch time, time on site. And that's the metric that I feel we should be pushing more and more.
Yes, well, of course, and that's part of the deeper value metrics. But I think with any metric can be gamed, right?
Yeah.
So you talk about watch time. Well, how many people leave their browser windows open and like let things play in the background?
Well, I mean, yeah, but you can say the same thing about TV. Everybody's like super into radio, TV, and it's still the media is out there that makes the most money, and the ones that they sell as the most valuable. But everybody's TV runs in the background, and nobody's paying attention to the ads because they're being forced on us. So I will believe watch time on digital much more than I would believe it on TV.
I don't believe anything anymore. But I do think like the lesson here is that when you're thinking digital, like when you are a person that makes videos for whatever reason. So I started my video series years ago after blogging for many years because I thought it would be a really effective way to get my message across. For me, I don't care about popularity. I don't care about being an influencer. In fact, I'm like offended if anybody calls me an influencer. For me, it's more like I have a message to get across. And so the video media seemed to be a really effective way to do that. So when I look at what really feels rewarding to me is when I start to see people show up time and time again on my videos and leaving comments and sending me messages and telling me that they, it's changed the way they think about things, or that it's helped them improve the way that they approach their marketing practice, or that they were able to win an argument at work because they were able to leverage one of my videos to do that. For me, that's the huge reward. And what I'm doing is like, I feel like my thing is to spread words and create like this army of much better marketing thinkers, much better media thinkers out in the world. And even if it's like one person at a time, that's super valuable. But I have a goal, and that's, like I know my audience and I know what I'm doing on that side. We've had this argument together where, we'll look at, oh, that video's done really well or whatever views wise. And then, we take a look and it doesn't have that same like depth.
Yeah.
Of engagement and so I don't feel satisfied. And I feel like, there aren't real metrics. Like somebody I just recently saw speak at a conference, actually the guy from the North Face, Tom Herbst. He was like, we don't measure ROI, we measure ROE, return on emotion, is what he talked about. Now, he didn't expand on that and talk about like the metrics that he uses, because I have a feeling that it's really hard. You don't have metrics for that. What you do have are emails and letters and phone calls and posts from customers who are like, this changed my life. The things that I'm getting, but at a bigger scale for a company like the North Face. And so if they get more of those than they get, you know, you sold me a piece of crap, then they probably think they're doing better.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the major challenges or things that social platforms have done is lower the bar for feedback, right? Like lower the bar for that type of feedback that, you know, somebody who writes a letter, somebody who picks up the phone, right? And somebody who writes an email, right? That's real effort, right? You know, like liking, retweeting, that's not an effort. Doesn't mean an endorsement. That's why like more and more the media savvy people, they say retweets and likes are not an endorsement. Because, you know, they understand that it's like, this is easy stuff. It has nothing to do with it. It's the people that make, you know, deep comments and reply to your content that have, you know, thoughtful comments and real feedback. That's the stuff that even we show and we highlight every single time when it comes across our work.
Yeah. So when we do the analytics reports for our clients, we don't just talk about the numbers. We also show those comments and that feedback. For me, that's the most important. Why do you think that companies, media and marketing still focuses so much on impressions and reach?
Because it's hard work.
Oh, you mean hard work? Like, what's hard work? To focus on impressions and reach?
It's hard work to do beyond that, right? Wow. It's hard work to...
Oh, you're saying they're lazy.
Well, yeah, it's easy. It's really easy. You sign an IO and I'll see you next month type of situation, right? That's literally it, right? You know, the work that most media buyers do is sign and I'll see you next month and give me the results, and that's it, right? There's nobody doing the same work that like somebody who's actually doing their own content does.
Yeah. Well, I think it's because they're big numbers. I think big numbers, you know, it's like, look at how big my numbers are. I'm a judge for a bunch of different awards things and digital awards online. And there are almost every one of the entries focus really on billions and millions of impressions and reach. And what I look for when I'm judging is the real results. And I'm not just talking about sales results. I'm also talking about, like, if they set a goal, for instance, of spreading the word or raising money for a fund and it's beyond their organization's, profit numbers, then for me, if they achieve their goal through what they did, their strategy was effective. Most businesses, we've talked about this before, is impressions and reach in the millions and billions don't matter. They're bogus. Engagement also, and that way doesn't necessarily like a like. What does that mean really at the end of the day? Did it help you achieve your goal? Most businesses at the end of the day don't need billions and millions, and they don't need more likes and retweets. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but why are we inundated by accounts telling us get more likes, get more, followers?
Well, because it's validating, right? So it feels validating. It's a big number to take up the chain to your CEO and say, look at how successful this was. Because, when you hire an agency or when you hire a media company, what you want to do at the end of the day is be successful in your job. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot offline is that the marketing world is completely in a hot mess. The CMOs are looked at as a laughing stock in a lot of organizations sitting around that table. In general, like marketing, like everybody's scratching their head and wondering, like, what does marketing really do other than, go out and wave their arms a lot and make pretty like little short feature films and stuff. Like, what does marketing do when, we even just recently had Tracy Chong from Strata Insights on it, talking about marketing only really affects a small percentage of brand value and the results for a brand. So what does marketing do? Well, I think this is part of the problem is, marketing hasn't stepped back. People in those positions haven't stepped back and evaluated what really does matter. How can they really actually affect the future of the organization? Their role, marketing, I always thought marketing's role is to connect the company with their customers. So whether it's finding them, understanding them, listening to them to help improve products, or whether it's finding them so that you can get in front of them when they're on their customer journey, or even working with operations and finance on making sure that pricing is right and the markets hasn't changed, and understanding trends, and working with customer service to make sure that it's usable enough. I feel like marketing could play such a great pivotal role in that, but instead we keep focusing on these stupid, I think really stupid things. And that's, it's ruining everything. They're peeing in their own pool, right? At the end of the day, when you don't value relationships, when you don't value the things that you should value, when you don't step back and assess what you should be doing in a role in marketing, whether you're internal to an organization or your agency or your media, whoever you are, that your role is basically to help your company achieve your goals, and you put too much emphasis on the wrong thing, of course you're going to look like an idiot at the end, and you're going to ruin everything.
Yeah.
It's not only ruining the digital space. It's not only coming in and ruining all of social media and ruining all of the great content and the customer experience out there, but you're also you're working yourself out of a job at the end of the day.
Whoa.
I know, I'm being really harsh. So those big numbers, right? The impressions and reach are really about growing a brand, right? Yep. And there's so much emphasis on that growth, but growth, as we know, doesn't always equal business success. It doesn't always mean profit. A lot of people conflate the two, growth and profit, and it's not actually true. If you look at a company we were listening to Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway the other day on what's their show
Their
called?
show's called Pivot.
They were talking about Lyft and the IPO and all that stuff. And they talked about the economics. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was for every ride that, makes $10, they lose $3 or something like that. Right. So then, if you expand on that, the more they grow, the more they'll lose. Yeah. In money. Their income will be high, but they'll lose more. Yeah. So their focus shouldn't be on growth. It should be on profitability. So how do they turn that, what they do have, how they have grown now, into being more profitable? And that is a marketing problem too. It's not just a problem for the CFO or the COO. It's also a problem for the CMO on that side of things. Now they need to build, I guess, better communication probably with their riders, because, people quite often take Uber and Lyft because it's a cheap way
to travel.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sorry to say this, but almost every disruptor out there is going to come to the realization that things cost what they cost because they cost what they cost. Yeah. But that's a whole other conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing sort of those costs creep up. Funny enough, on that specific podcast, Cara specifically mentioned that she hailed a Lyft or Uber, and it was the cost was astronomical, and she's like, I'm just going to take a cab. Right? It's okay, well, and it's just the same thing. They just created this veneer. Yeah, that's a whole. We should definitely do some sort of conversation with somebody around disruption, and because disruption in and of itself, what it had come to mean is free and cheap. Yeah. And it wasn't actually disrupting anything but people's livelihoods. Yeah. At the end of the day, but that's a whole other that's another rant. Just wait till you get me going. Either way, those are sort of the three things, and there's more ways in which legacy ideas of media marketing have ruined everything. Mm-hmm. But the three that I wanted to focus on here, because otherwise we're going to get way too long and go way over, is
quality equaling high levels of production, seasonal and campaign thinking, and number 3, those, big growth, big impressions, breadth versus depth kind of numbers. Is there anything else that you wanted to also focus on when you think about how media marketing have ruined everything?
Well, I think for me, it's always been this issue about just constantly pushing something, pushing a message, and not listening, right? And that's
a big one.
It's a big one, right? Most of the success I've had in the stuff I've worked on is by, taking time and not just constantly being like, watch this, listen to this, like this, right? It's, oh, what are they talking about? And getting to the conversation and stuff. And, I miss that that way of thinking, or I just don't see it in terms of brands. They just took over these platforms very quickly. And it's like, okay, well, we're just going to put an ad here because it's easy. And
so what do you think this is a good question. And I don't know if we're going to totally answer it here, but why do you think that brands don't spend time listening? Why, marketing has been so bad at listening and doesn't value it? Like, it's not that expensive.
Fundamentally, I think it's education. It's the agencies not doing the right work. It's the agencies going for the quick sell and the flashy campaigns that impress the client. I'm doing the quote things, but it's fundamentally education. This is a battle we deal with on a weekly basis, where we get leads, we get clients knocking at our door, and we say, well, we need 6 to 8 weeks of deep study, deep learning, listening to the audience, and they're like, we just wanted to run Facebook ads. And you're like, oh, Jesus. I literally had a conversation this week with a small company. They were like, we're talking about, their tactics. And it's like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, Facebook ads. It's like, why? I literally asked why. And he's like, oh, because it was easy. I was like, all right. I was like back and forth with him on tactics. And I said, have you thought about this, like a physical sign? And he told me, oh, yeah, that works the best. And I'm like, okay, then why aren't you focusing on what works the best instead of what's easiest, right? It's easy because you can click buy and that's it. And that's, to me, like one of the biggest issues with the whole platforms. They've made buying ads so easy, but strategy goes out the window, right? And so every single company out there, startup, small business, big business, thinks it's like, oh, we can just buy ads. And that's it, right? And that's, to me, one of the biggest issues when it comes to this thing.
And if you haven't listened to one of our former podcasts, that I like to give is that in the US alone, there are 6 million businesses advertising. 6 million advertisers on Facebook in the US alone. If you're trying to reach your customers, you are battling that without a strategy. Like, it's a
drop in a bucket.
Well, it's in, and then there's the click farms and everything else. So, we often say to smaller companies that can't afford to do full on content and stuff to think about doing to experiment with some ads on various different platforms. Like, we know a small startup that they don't have much of a budget at all, but, that they do know where their audience is at, right? Their audience is on Twitter and they're talking about films, right? Mm-hmm. So they're going to film festivals. So, hey, why not take a small amount of money and focus some of the great messaging that you've put together, because these people aren't dummies when it comes to understanding their audience. They are their audience. Mm-hmm. And see, just a couple bucks and experiment with that. You could get some data from that, but think of it more of less of a, this is my campaign, mm-hmm. and more of a sort of a listening type of tactic. Yeah. And then you take that data that you get from that and understanding who is it and what messages are working, mm-hmm. and then use that in trying to build out the strategy going forward as well. And the content. Yeah. Absolutely. All right. So I feel really good. I've ranted it all out,
Yeah.
How about yourself?
How about myself?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, everything, we did. This podcast started as us having breakfast and having a conversation about, what we deal with and the battles that we fight. So
this is, for people that don't know, we're married and we run a business together. And so, yeah, we kind of are single-minded on a lot of these things.
Very. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, like, again, this week I was in a meeting and I was being introduced to a bunch of startups and I was being, just to get some insights, and they wanted just to pick my brain, the whole pick my brain thing. My friend who had invited me, he says, it was really funny. Every single company you talked to, you were bashing social media. You were saying, like, don't focus on that and focus on learning and then figuring out who your customer is, as opposed to just running ads and stuff like that. And, that's the space we're at right now, right? It's just, that's what I feel like these platforms have lost their value, other than being media companies that you just put a logo on.
So just so you know, we are actually going to double down and really focus. Speaking of strategy, we are focusing on anatomy of a strategy. This podcast, a lot more in the next little while. We'd kind of been experimenting, learning, listening ourselves for the first 6 months, I guess, of us doing this.
We're about to hit a year with this podcast.
Oh,
even though we haven't, published. We've published every couple of weeks and months and stuff. But
if you go back into it, so like I always like to say, like, when you come out of the gate with, any sort of long-term sustainable publishing plan, can't expect to be perfect. And this is what a lot of these creators that have built audiences, they started from like really crappy content. They built their way up over time. And so, and now they look like they're super polished, but they came from somewhere else. And that's basically what we've done. But all of this is to say is we have some, we just had Tracy Chong on the podcast. We have Erica M coming up. I am super excited about that one. If you don't know Erica M, you've been living where you're either really way too young or you've been like living in a bubble. She is one of the pioneers of many things, including she was one of the first VJs on Much Music here in Canada. Mm-hmm. And then she started one of the first online networks of mommy bloggers, basically. And talking with her was just so much fun. We had such a good conversation. Lots of bleeps in that one. And then we also have some really amazing guests. Kelly Hoey coming up talking about networking. We are hoping to get some pretty big hitters. Yeah. Brian, if you're listening, I hope we can get to talk to you next week. Brian Solis. A lot of old contacts that are doing really cool things nowadays in and around this space. We really want to dig into what anatomy of a strategy is really all about, which is getting to the bottom of, what does it mean to be strategic in an age where it's kind of hard to keep up with where the audience is at and what's happening as far as the tactical landscape. So we'll be talking to a lot of people from a lot of different perspectives, some of them with a long history of experience, some of them who have most recently hit a viral sensation. So we're talking to somebody pretty soon about having a TikTok. If you guys aren't familiar with TikTok, what is it? It's like a musical. It's
Vine. It's like Vine 2.0, if you remember what Vine was. But yeah,
well, they're from music.
Yeah, it used to be called Musical.ly. It became TikTok. And
a much older person who's a professional who was experimenting on TikTok and ended up going super viral. And we're going to be talking to him about his experience on there. So there's all sorts of great things coming up on this podcast.
Awesome. So again,
so subscribe.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. If you're enjoying this podcast, please share it with somebody, a colleague, friend, and rate us. We've gotten a lot of new listeners over the last couple of weeks, which is amazing, and it's really encouraged us to double down on this show. And thank you very much for listening. Have a good one.
Bye now.